Let's talk about a weapon from the First World War. One you couldn't see, one you couldn't dodge, but one you could definitely hear. In fact, it was a sound so relentless, so completely overwhelming, that it was a weapon in its own right. One designed to drive thousands of soldiers insane long before a bullet ever came near them. To understand it, you first have to hear how a soldier described it.
This quote from a British officer, man, it just hits you, right? He calls it a mechanical drumbeat. That's the key. This wasn't just the random noise of battle. This was a psychological siege, a constant industrial presence that didn't just surround you, it got inside your head and wouldn't leave.
To really get a sense of the scale we're talking about, just look at this number, 170 million. That's how many artillery shells the British Army alone fired during the war. The French fired even more. This was noise and destruction industrialized on a level humanity had never, ever seen before.
So what does that giant number actually mean on the ground? Well, it means this: 3 shells every single second. That was the rate of fire during the opening week of the Battle of the Somme. To try to imagine it, for 7 straight days, there wasn't a single moment of silence. Not one.
Right, so how did we even get here? World War I was supposed to be a quick war of movement, but that's not what happened. Instead, it bogged down into this 400-mile-long static front of trenches. And in that stalemate, the king of the battlefield became the artillery piece, turning the whole front into a factory that produced one thing: continuous, inescapable noise.
And you gotta understand, this wasn't just one monotonous sound. Oh no, it was a whole symphony of destruction. You had the constant, sharp crack of the standard 18-pounders. Layered on top of that was the deep, earth-shaking boom of howitzers firing shells that weighed as much as a man. And then you had these absolute monsters, the railway guns, firing projectiles that weighed over a ton. It was an entire orchestra of noise, creating this impenetrable wall of sound.
Okay, so that's the big picture, the industrial scale of it all. But let's bring it down to the human level. What did it actually feel like for a soldier huddled in a muddy trench with all of that going on? We have to go from the factory floor down to the terrifyingly personal.
You know, these soldiers became unwilling experts in the anatomy of an explosion. First there was the rumble, a constant thunder that was always there, in the background. Then came the whistle, the shriek, and they learned, terrifyingly, to judge by the pitch of that sound whether a shell was going to land far away or right on top of them. And finally, the blast wave. Not just a sound, but a physical force that hit you in the chest, rattled your teeth, and could literally turn your internal organs to liquid without leaving a single scratch on your body.
This is how survivors described it, and I don't think there's a better analogy. Living inside a drum while giants beat it from the outside. The ground wasn't just shaking, it was heaving, violently. Men said their hands trembled so much they couldn't even light a cigarette. They weren't just hearing the war, they were physically inside it, feeling every single impact vibrate straight through their bones.
And make no mistake, this wasn't random. The Germans perfected a technique called Trommelfeuer, drum fire. And the name tells you everything. This was designed explicitly for psychological destruction. The idea was to coordinate their guns in overlapping waves, to create a seamless mechanical rhythm of explosions. No gaps, no silence, no hope of rest. It was meant to obliterate your will to fight.
So what happens to the human brain when you subject it to that kind of unending assault, day in, day out? Oh, it's not a machine. It's not made of steel. It has its limits. And under that kind of pressure, it begins to break. Our brains are just not built for this. Sleep was almost impossible. Soldiers were getting maybe 2 or 3 hours a night for weeks on end. And we now know that after just 48 hours without proper sleep, the brain starts to hallucinate. After 72 hours, you literally can't tell the difference between what's real and what's in your head. Your ability to think clearly just plummets. Men started seeing their dead friends in the trenches with them, and I don't mean that as a figure of speech. They were having literal waking nightmares.
So of course the military had no framework for any of this. In 1915, they came up with this term, shell shock. The theory was that the concussive blasts were causing tiny invisible injuries to the brain. And, they were partly right, that was happening. But it didn't come close to explaining the sheer number of men who were breaking down, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak, without a single physical wound on them.
The scale of the crisis was just staggering. During the Battle of the Somme, 1 in every 6 British casualties wasn't from a bullet or shrapnel. It was a case of shell shock. This wasn't a few isolated incidents. This was a mass psychological event that threatened to completely overwhelm the Army's medical services.
Today we actually have a term for what happened to these men:
learned helplessness. It's a psychological principle. When any living creature is exposed to a threat that it cannot control, cannot predict, and cannot escape, eventually its brain just gives up. It shuts down. The breakdown wasn't a moral failure or weakness. It was a predictable, biological response to a totally impossible situation.
But the military command didn't see it as a biological response. They were terrified that breaking down would become an easy way out of the trenches. So their response wasn't one of compassion. It was one of calculated cruelty.
You just have this massive, tragic disconnect. On one side, you have men whose brains are literally malfunctioning under unendurable stress. And on the other, you have the Army's official diagnosis: cowardice, faking it, or a simple lack of moral fiber. Can you imagine?
So the cures, if you could even call them that, were straight-up torture. Doctors were ordered to give electric shocks to the throats of men who couldn't speak. They used cold water submersion, starvation, solitary confinement. The logic was as simple as it was brutal. Make the treatment so terrifying that a soldier would choose the hell of the trenches over the torture of the hospital.
And for those who still couldn't cope, over 300 British soldiers were executed by firing squad for cowardice or desertion. These were men who, today, we would immediately recognize as victims of severe trauma, their minds destroyed by the very war they were being punished for not fighting.
The war finally ended in 1918, but for hundreds of thousands of survivors, the sound never stopped. The psychological damage was permanent, and it would cast this long, dark shadow over the rest of their lives.
At a minimum, we estimate that over 80,000 British soldiers suffered from severe shell shock, and that's considered a very conservative number. The real total across all the RVs involved was likely over 500,000. 500,000 minds shattered by sound. This timeline just shows how long that echo lasted. In 1929, more than a decade after the war ended, over 120,000 British veterans were still getting disability pensions from mental illness. And it was the experience of these men that directly led to our modern understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
Back in civilian life, the world became a minefield of auditory triggers. The rumble of a thunderstorm, a car backfiring, fireworks, even just heavy construction noise. Any of it could instantly plunge these men right back into the terror of the trenches, triggering violent panic attacks and flashbacks.
This anecdote is just heartbreaking, and it illustrates the damage perfectly. An American veteran, years after the war is over, hears 4th of July fireworks, and his brain has a complete psychotic break. To him, that sound isn't a celebration, it's the incoming whistle of German artillery. The war was over, but the bombardment in his mind was not.
Ultimately, World War I proved something terrifying. It proved that industrial warfare had created a weapon that could break the human mind just as efficiently as shrapnel could break a body. And it revealed a whole new kind of casualty: the soldier who walks away physically whole but is condemned to hear the sound of the